Henry Clay was a Kentucky statesman and a great orator who became known as the Great Compromiser. Henry Clay, one of the most influential American politicians of the 19th century, was born in Hanover County, Virginia on April 12, 1777. He came from modest circumstances. He had a natural gift for persuasion. Clay's ambition and drive were remarkable. He received limited formal education but studied law under prominent attorneys. When he was 20 years old, he moved west to Lexington, Kentucky, seeking opportunity in the expanding frontier. Then in 1799, Clay was admitted to the Kentucky bar and quickly established himself as a skilled lawyer and powerful speaker. Henry Clay was a slaveholder, though he expressed conflicted views about the institution throughout his life. In 1803, Clay was elected to the Kentucky General Assembly, beginning his long political career. Clay represented farmers, merchants, and landowners. He defended clients in court with passionate eloquence. After establishing his reputation in Kentucky, he sought higher office. He was appointed to fill an unexpired term in the United States Senate in 1806. He was technically too young to serve, as the Constitution required senators to be 30 years old, but no one challenged his appointment. In 1807, Clay returned to Kentucky and continued building his political base. Within 2 years, he married Lucretia Hart, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Lucretia, along with her family connections, helped elevate Clay's standing in Kentucky society. Clay was elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives, where he became Speaker. He began to develop his vision for America's economic future. America was a young nation trying to find its identity and its place in the world, and Clay believed strongly in building the country's infrastructure and industry. Henry Clay was not a cautious politician content with local influence. He was an ambitious visionary who wanted to shape the entire nation. In 1810, Clay was elected to the United States House of Representatives. 1 year later, at the age of 34, he was elected Speaker of the House. Clay was literally the youngest man ever to hold that position, and he transformed it from a largely ceremonial role into a position of real power. In 1812, Clay was one of the leading war hawks pushing for war against Britain. The British were interfering with American shipping and allegedly supporting Indian attacks on the frontier. Clay believed that war would defend American honor and potentially allow the United States to seize Canadian territory. He gave fiery speeches demanding action. Clay helped push President James Madison toward declaring war. The War of 1812 was controversial and divisive, but Clay never wavered in his support. Clay served as one of the commissioners who negotiated the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, which ended the War of 1812. He worked alongside John Quincy Adams and Albert Gallatin. The negotiations were difficult and protracted. Clay proved himself an effective diplomat, though he clashed with Adams over strategy and tactics. The treaty essentially restored relations to their pre-war status, but Clay considered it a victory because it secured American independence and respect. After the war, Clay returned to Congress with even greater influence. He began developing what he called the American system. Clay's American system was all about economic nationalism. He advocated for a national bank to stabilize currency and provide credit. He supported protective tariffs to help American manufacturers compete with foreign goods. He championed internal improvements like roads, canals, and bridges to connect the country and facilitate commerce. Clay believed that a strong federal government should actively promote economic development. The American system became Clay's signature policy vision. He spent decades fighting for its implementation. Clay argued that the nation needed to be economically independent from Europe. He wanted to create a self-sufficient American economy where the different regions supported each other. The North would manufacture goods, the South and West would produce raw materials and food, and the whole system would be connected by federally funded infrastructure. But Clay's vision faced significant opposition. Many Southerners opposed protective tariffs because they raised the cost of manufactured goods that the South had to import. States' rights advocates opposed federal spending on internal improvements. Presidents vetoed internal improvement bills that Clay championed. Clay won some battles and lost others, but he never abandoned his core beliefs. In 1820, the nation faced a crisis over slavery's expansion. Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, which would upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. Northern congressmen wanted to restrict slavery's spread. Southern congressmen insisted that new states had the right to permit slavery. The debate grew heated and threatened to tear the Union apart. Clay engineered what became known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state, and slavery would be prohibited in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, except for Missouri. Clay used all his skills of persuasion and negotiation. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, building coalitions and finding middle ground. The compromise passed, and Clay earned his reputation as the Great Compromiser. He believed that preserving the Union was more important than any single issue. Clay sought the presidency in 1824. He was one of 4 major candidates, all from the Democratic-Republican Party. The others were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. Jackson won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but no candidate won a majority. The election was thrown to the House of Representatives, where Clay, as Speaker, wielded enormous influence. Clay could not win himself because the House had to choose from the top 3 electoral vote recipients, and he had finished 4th. But he could determine who would become president. Clay despised Jackson, whom he considered a dangerous military man unfit for the presidency. Clay supported Adams, who shared his views on the American system and federal power. Adams won the House vote and became president. President Adams then appointed Clay as his Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters immediately cried foul. They accused Clay and Adams of making a corrupt bargain, trading Clay's support for the cabinet position. Clay and Adams both denied any improper deal. Clay insisted he supported Adams based on principle and policy agreement. But the accusation of a corrupt bargain haunted Clay for the rest of his life. It damaged his reputation and gave his enemies a powerful weapon against him. Clay served as Secretary of State from 1825 to 1829. He negotiated several commercial treaties and worked to expand American trade. But the Adams administration struggled politically. Jackson and his supporters organized opposition and built a new political coalition. In the 1828 presidential election, Jackson defeated Adams decisively. Clay left office and returned to Kentucky. But Clay's political career was far from over. In 1831, he was elected to the United States Senate. Clay was determined to stop Jackson's agenda and position himself for another presidential run. He opposed Jackson's war on the Second Bank of the United States. Clay believed the national bank was essential for economic stability. Jackson vetoed the bank's recharter, and Clay made it a central issue in the 1832 presidential election. Clay ran against Jackson in 1832 as the national Republican candidate. Clay campaigned on the American system and attacked Jackson's use of executive power. But Jackson was immensely popular, especially among common voters who saw him as their champion against elites. Jackson won overwhelmingly. Clay was devastated by the loss. He had now failed twice to win the presidency. In the Senate, Clay became a leader of the Whig Party, which formed in opposition to Jackson. The Whigs brought together national Republicans, former Federalists, and others who opposed Jackson's policies. Clay was the Whigs' most prominent spokesman. He gave powerful speeches attacking what he called Jackson's monarchical abuse of power. Clay accused Jackson of acting like King Andrew, ruling by executive decree rather than working with Congress. In 1833, another crisis threatened the Union. South Carolina nullified federal tariff laws and threatened to secede if the federal government tried to collect tariffs by force. Jackson prepared to use military force against South Carolina. Clay worked frantically to find a compromise. He introduced a bill to gradually reduce tariff rates over several years. The compromise tariff of 1833 passed, and South Carolina backed down. Clay had once again saved the Union through compromise. Clay sought the Whig nomination for president in 1840. But the Whigs passed over Clay in favor of William Henry Harrison, a military hero who they believed had broader appeal. Clay was bitter about being denied the nomination. Harrison won the election but died after only 1 month in office. Vice President John Tyler succeeded Harrison. Tyler, a former Democrat, opposed much of the Whig agenda. Clay and Tyler clashed repeatedly. Tyler vetoed Clay's bills to recharter a national bank and raise tariffs. In 1844, Clay finally won the Whig nomination for president. He faced Democrat James K. Polk. The major issue was the annexation of Texas. Clay tried to straddle the issue, neither fully supporting nor opposing annexation. He wanted to avoid alienating voters on either side. But his equivocation cost him support. Polk ran on an expansionist platform, calling for the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of Oregon. Polk won a narrow victory. Clay had now lost 3 presidential elections. He would never occupy the office he so desperately sought. Clay retired from the Senate in 1842 but returned in 1849 as the nation faced its greatest crisis yet. The Mexican-American War had added vast new territories, and the question of slavery's expansion into these territories threatened to destroy the Union. California applied for statehood as a free state. Southerners demanded guarantees for slavery. The debate grew increasingly bitter and sectional. Clay, now 73 years old and in failing health, proposed a comprehensive compromise. California would enter as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized without restrictions on slavery, allowing residents to decide the issue. The slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself would remain legal there. A stronger fugitive slave law would require Northerners to help return escaped slaves to their owners. Clay introduced these measures as a package deal. The debate over Clay's compromise lasted for months. Clay gave some of his greatest speeches, pleading with both sections to make concessions for the sake of the Union. He was often too weak to stand for long periods. His voice, once powerful and commanding, was now weakened by age and illness. But his passion and conviction remained strong. Clay warned that disunion would lead to civil war and catastrophe. Clay faced opposition from both sides. Northern anti-slavery advocates like William Seward opposed any compromise with slavery. Southern fire-eaters like John C. Calhoun demanded absolute guarantees for slavery. Younger senators like Stephen Douglas eventually took over the legislative maneuvering. Douglas broke Clay's omnibus bill into separate measures, which passed individually. The Compromise of 1850 was enacted, though not exactly as Clay had envisioned it. Clay had achieved his greatest triumph, preserving the Union one more time. But the compromise was fragile and temporary. It postponed conflict but did not resolve the fundamental disagreement over slavery. Clay knew the compromise was imperfect, but he believed it bought precious time. He hoped that somehow, in the years ahead, Americans would find a permanent solution. Clay's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from tuberculosis and other ailments. He remained in Washington, too weak to return to Kentucky. Clay spent his final months in his rooms at the National Hotel. Old friends and colleagues visited him. He received reports on political developments. Clay worried about the nation's future and whether the Union he had worked so hard to preserve would survive. On June 29, 1852, Henry Clay died in Washington, D.C. He was 75 years old. His death was mourned throughout the nation. Even his political enemies acknowledged his greatness. Clay had served his country for nearly half a century. He had never achieved his ultimate ambition of becoming president, but he had shaped American politics and policy more than most presidents. Clay's funeral was one of the most elaborate in American history up to that time. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands of mourners filed past his casket. Clay was buried in Lexington, Kentucky, in a cemetery that overlooked the city he had called home for more than 50 years. Henry Clay's legacy is complex and controversial. He was a slaveholder who spoke against slavery's moral wrong but never took decisive action to end it. He freed some slaves in his will but not all of them. He supported colonization schemes to send freed blacks to Africa rather than integrating them into American society. Clay's views on slavery reflected the contradictions of many 19th-century Americans who recognized slavery's evil but lacked the courage or conviction to oppose it completely. But Clay's contributions to American political development were immense. He transformed the Speaker of the House into a powerful position. He championed economic policies that helped industrialize the nation. He negotiated compromises that preserved the Union during critical moments. Clay believed deeply in the American experiment and worked tirelessly to make it succeed. Clay was known as the Great Compromiser, but he was also a man of strong principles. He never wavered in his support for the American system. He believed that government should actively promote economic development and national unity. Clay was willing to compromise on tactics and timing, but not on his fundamental vision for America. Clay was one of the greatest orators in American history. His speeches could move audiences to tears or rouse them to action. He had a commanding presence and a voice that could fill the largest halls. Clay used his rhetorical gifts to advance his policies and build political coalitions. He understood that in a democracy, persuasion was essential to achieving change. Clay mentored a generation of younger politicians. Abraham Lincoln called Clay his beau ideal of a statesman and was deeply influenced by Clay's economic nationalism and his efforts to preserve the Union. Many of Clay's ideas about federal support for economic development were later implemented by Lincoln and the Republican Party. Henry Clay never became president, but he was one of the most important American political figures of the 19th century. He served longer in Congress than almost any of his contemporaries. He shaped national policy on economic development, territorial expansion, and sectional conflict. Clay's compromises on slavery ultimately failed to prevent civil war, but they bought crucial time for the nation to grow stronger before facing its ultimate test. Clay was ambitious, sometimes to a fault. His desire for the presidency drove many of his political calculations. But Clay also genuinely loved his country and wanted to serve it. He could have retired to a comfortable life in Kentucky, but he kept returning to Washington because he believed he had more to contribute. In his final years, Clay wondered whether his life's work had been in vain. The Union he had fought so hard to preserve seemed more fragile than ever. The compromises he had engineered were unraveling. But Clay never lost faith in America's potential. He believed that despite all its flaws and contradictions, the American experiment in self-government was worth preserving and perfecting. Henry Clay died before the Civil War that he had worked so hard to prevent. He did not live to see the Union torn apart or slavery finally abolished. But his influence extended beyond his death. The political skills he demonstrated, the policies he championed, and the example he set of putting the Union above sectional interests all contributed to the nation's eventual survival and growth. Clay was even in death a symbol of what America could achieve through compromise and dedication to the common good. His life represented both the possibilities and the limitations of American democracy in the 19th century. He rose from modest origins to national prominence through talent and ambition. He shaped his nation's development through decades of service. But he could not resolve the fundamental contradiction between American ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery. That task would fall to the next generation, and it would require not compromise but conflict to finally resolve.